Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a transplanted New Englander who makes her home in Northern Virginia. In addition to writing upmarket fiction with environmental themes, she writes nonfiction in the science, technology, and business categories with a passion for research, seashells, birds, and the ocean. She's been a member of the Boston Malacological Club since she was 10 years old. She's the former vice president of communications for the Women's Fiction Writers Association, the founder of Women's Fiction Day, and is the executive editor of the WFWA magazine WriteOn. She has an MFA from George Mason University, and The Pelican Tide is her first novel. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Sharon J. Wishnow.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sharon, as you well know, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Oh gosh, and that is such a fantastic, frightening question to answer, which is probably the reason why it took me so long. I have always been a writer. I made my living as a writer, as a nonfiction writer. And when we get to a certain age, we expect a certain level of excellence and experience before we try anything new. And I didn't feel I had anything to say until I was probably in my late 40s that I was ready to write a book. I had taken fiction classes during my MFA program. I'm an MFA in nonfiction writing, and I was wholly intimidated by these people who were incredibly well read and who were spinning stories and characters and understood something that I just wasn't part of that club. And I think it took a lot of time to get the courage. And then just one day I was like, if I'm going to do this, I need to give it a shot. And that was in my late 40s, almost knocking on the door to 50 until it happened.
And you've certainly been around a lot of women fiction writers in the association. So I bet some of that became osmosis for you.
Yes. Yes. Joining WFWA was a changing point for me.
You have a very interesting hobby or fascination with malacological creatures and have since a very early age. Tell our listeners what that term is and how you were drawn to that study.
So malacology is the study of seashells. It's the study of the actual physical shell and the animals that live inside. I grew up in New England on the beach. I think I probably took my first steps on the beach, and I've been collecting shells since I was a small child. And I was the kid who wanted to know the names of all the shells. I knew dogs had different names. So therefore shells had different names. And I spent my time, kids were pulling Nancy Drew off the library, and I was pulling books about seashells. And it just became almost like a little kid obsession that my parents fed, and people would bring me seashells from their travels. And we discovered the Boston Malacological Club, which is a club that's run out of Harvard University. And God bless my father, he took me to shell meetings every day until I graduated college. Not every day, every month, from the point I was about 10 until I was about 19. It was a daddy-daughter date. We would walk through Harvard University. I would go to these shell lectures, and these people were incredible influences on my life. These were scientists at the top of their field, and they were so excited to have a young person there. I'm no longer a young person at the meetings, but it really was a very formative thing as I was going through biology classes and science classes and just kind of learning who I was. I have this incredibly nerdy hobby that I found people who shared.
Well, those are such special memories for you and your father. Does any of that have to do with the premise of your book, naming it the Pelican Tide? You could certainly have some sea creatures involved.
So my first book that I landed my agent with was a whole entire book about seashells. And that book is someday will make its premise. But I am always drawn to writing about the ocean. And The Pelican Tide certainly was a book that was very ocean themed. And it just sort of fit into the aesthetic of what I was really interested in writing.
Well, once you wrote this manuscript, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to choose a hybrid, a small press, or did you self publish?
So I went through the agent route. This is my fourth book, but the first one to sell. And so I had an agent on my previous book, and that was, I was literally learning how to write. I have this MFA degree, but it was in nonfiction writing. And I thought, well, I know how to do one, I can do the other. No, writing fiction is it is a very, very different journey. And so I went and to learn what happens. I knew about agents, I knew about pitching, but I didn't know any of the vocabulary. I didn't know anything. I have an editing degree, but fiction is just so different. So I was fortunate enough to get to land an agent. We weren't able to sell my first book. She didn't like my second. And so now, this book came on the scene, and, she loved it. There's a very special character in the book that's a pelican. And she kind of prepared me that it wasn't going to sell just because of how the market was. And then lo and behold, we got a call from Lake Union that they wanted to talk.
That's so exciting. So many of us authors dream about having an agent and publishing with one of the big publishing houses. And so many of us end up with independent houses and small presses. And that's great too. But it's very exciting for you to have the agent and go that route.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if I can tell the story, that's a really funny story about the call. My agent, Ann Leslie, always said, I'm only going to call you if there's good news or if there's anything to tell you. And she never calls. She's an emailer. She doesn't text. She doesn't, she never calls. And it was like, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had just finished up my day. I was in the garden, and I just like ran to take a shower, and the phone rang, and I looked down, and I never even take the phone in with me into the bathroom. It just happened to be that day. And I looked down, and I saw it was my agent. And I had literally just stepped out of the shower. I have no clothes on. I am dripping wet, and it's Anne. And I start to shake because there's only one reason she's going to call me. So I'm like, well, I can't call her back. I have to answer the phone. So I grabbed the first towel I could find. I wrapped myself up. I am dripping, and I'm sitting on the corner of the bathtub while she's telling me that, a publisher wants to talk to me about my book. I don't think she knows that story, but yeah. Talk about being caught surprise.
Yes, that is so wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What do you think is the most challenging part of your artistic process?
I think knowing when to say you're done, that's really hard. As an editor of nonfiction, I'm very good at knowing there's a deadline. The piece can only be 1,500 words. The interview only had so much information. The magazine has to go to bed. But when you're writing a novel and you are enveloped with these people who eat with you and sleep with you, and when you brush your teeth, they're in your head, and when you take a walk, they're everywhere, and you are researching everything about the details of their lives, it's very, for me, overwhelming. And it's a little bit of analysis paralysis to know how to get those ideas and thoughts coherently on the page and then say, you're done. Or it's now time for somebody to read it.
Well, I know the ocean inspires you, but what was the inspiration for writing this particular book?
Oh, so this book was one of those that landed in my lap kind of things. It was the end of 2019, was right before the pandemic, and the calendar was soon ticking over. And the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which is in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is my home, home state is Massachusetts, was doing a 1 hour seminar on the Deepwater Horizon 10 years later. And I could not believe it had been 10 years since that accident happened. I had remembered it. I had remembered logging online and watching the oil spewing into the ocean and being horrified. And it was 10 years. And so I watched this because I'm always interested in the ocean. And I watched this 1 hour special about how the environment had recovered and what was happening to the wildlife and the animals. And then it was over. And then I said, well, what happened to the people? Like, you don't live through an oil spill and just poof, everything is fine. And I really started getting curious about the people. And so I started, and the interesting thing about the oil spill is it's all documented. I watched hundreds of hours of videos. I've counted the boats in the ocean. I've watched the rig burn. I've watched the oil spew. And then I went and I've read several very detailed accounts of the oil spill. And the people. And then in order to find out what happened to the people, I had to decide, well, what people? And I did some research and discovered that Grand Isle, Louisiana, which is the only inhabited barrier island in southern Louisiana, was sort of ground zero for the spill. And it was this perfect microcosm of a society and a culture and an island. And that's where we put centered the story. And then I just started populating, who lives there. And I delved into newspaper accounts and first person accounts and talked to a lot of people. I even spoke to an oil rig worker. And there he was. And that's how the story grew.
Very fascinating. And I love your research there. Do you complete your research before you begin, or do you do it as you go along?
I usually spend quite a bit of time on research ahead of time. The research always informs the people. You don't know what you don't know. And if I'm not one who wants to rush into a story. I do a lot of research and fact checking along the way, but I find if I have that background to work with, then it's much easier to figure out who these people are.
Well, we always talk about writers being introverts and wanting to just sit in their little cave and write. And not a lot of us want to go out and promote ourselves or have a marketing degree or anything like that. What have you found as far as pre-publicity for this book? What have you been doing, and anything that you think is working or something you've tried that doesn't work?
So I don't know if it was pre-publicity or just me needing to do something. About a year before the book was ready to come out, I finally got off my little butt and started a newsletter. It's called Research for Writers and Other Curious People. And a lot of people don't do newsletters because they feel they have nothing to say about themselves. And I agree, like, nobody knows who I am. But research is what I do better than a lot of people. And so I write this newsletter basically for my amusement. And apparently other people like it. I have a pretty good following now. So I have created my own platform. Um, the greatest thing you can do to promote yourself is to connect to a writing community. I belong to the Northern Virginia Writers Club. I belong to the Women's National Book Association, which is a really interesting group of writers and readers. These are the people who will read your book. And they're the DC chapter, which is my local chapter. These are like retired diplomats and Congress critters and executives. And these women are just absolutely amazing to speak with. Women's Fiction Writers Association is the reason this book got published. And so the more people I have reached out to and just connected with on a genuine level, the where the opportunities come into. Social media is, you put it out there because your publisher wants you to do it, but it doesn't really move the needle unless you're somebody famous. I happen to have a publicist I'm working with, but she's also one of my dear friends. So for us, we've been waiting for this book for 10 years. So it's been a labor of love. And just speaking to anybody who wants to hear about the book. And asking people to invite me to your book club. That's been a really good promotion.
I do love to visit book clubs, whether it's on Zoom around the world or whether it's in somebody's actual living room. You know, when readers read your book, they just find so many things that you really didn't even intend, but they they come up with all sorts of
Yeah.
theories about why you wrote a passage a certain way.
Absolutely. And so, which is a little nerve-wracking too, because you're face to face and you're like, what if they don't like it? Which goes back to the sort of us being over 50 and how we expect people to behave and treat us. But that's, when you write a book and you put it out there, it's no longer yours. So you kind of have to roll with it.
And many book clubs, like the one I belong to, they've been in existence for 30 years and they've never had an author come to their book club. So they really treat you like a celebrity, just like we think of when we have our favorite authors. You know, if one of them showed up in our living room, we'd be thrilled.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we fangirl.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about set up the passage you brought to share today and then read so we can hear your tone and voice in the book?
So what's interesting about the tone and the voice is this. So I have an audiobook that's coming out and it's being read by a woman named Sophie Amos. And Sophie is actually a very well-known audiobook reader, and she's won several awards. And if I played a clip of her, everyone who's ever heard an audiobook would be like, I know her. And so originally I was like, oh, do I want the audiobook that everyone has already heard? Well, as it turns out, she's a native of New Orleans. And we had a very long and detailed back and forth about what accent should she use to read this book, because this takes place in southern Louisiana. And the Cajun accent is a little difficult to understand. And I told her I didn't want like a North Carolina accent or just an accent that affected Southern accent. I said I wasn't going to read it because I'm from New England, and if you give me enough time, I can park the car. So when I read the book, it's really funny because I don't sound anything like my people sound. So Sophie's actually sent me all these clips, and she's picked a lower South Gulf accent, and several of the characters are going to have a little bit of a Cajun zhuzh to it, I guess you could call it. So it's really kind of fun. The passage I've picked to read is a little bit I kind of went back and forth and where to start. And usually when I read it, it's from the beginning of the book. But one of the major characters in the book is a pelican, and his name is Gumbo. And Gumbo was a fledgling who he lost his family and he was rescued on the beach by the Babineau family. They're the family in the book. And he's not a pet, he's sort of chosen to live with them. And he is very much part of the family, and he's very attached to one particular family member, and it's the daughter, and her name is Minnow, like the fish. And Gumbo the pelican is modeled after a real life pelican who unfortunately died several years ago, whose name was Big Bird. He lived in Tanzania. So the passage I've picked is about one of Gumbo's antics, so your listeners can hear about Gumbo the pelican and the fact that Gumbo is actually the reason I sold this book. Everybody has fallen in love with this critter. So the setup is it's after the main action in the book. We have an oil spill in the process. And Josie Babineau, Josie is the owner of a restaurant. And because of the oil spill, nobody's coming to the restaurant. The island has been pretty much shut down. There's a fishing ban. And these are all things that actually happened during the oil spill. My book follows the 87 days of the actual spill. And so in this particular scene, there's media people who are on the beach waiting for to film the oil coming in. And so this passage is about a particular person who happens to be having lunch at the restaurant and what happens when he encounters Gumbo the pelican. Josie showered and ironed her chef's jacket, appreciating how her hands were able to smooth the wrinkles, transforming chaos into order. The feeling increased as she walked into Odil's. That's her restaurant. This is still my restaurant. I control what happens inside, no matter what happens outside. She sighed. The dining room was empty, not a single lunch being enjoyed. The marina deck had a few stragglers. One man stood on a chair, a fork in his hand. Another man was pulling at his arm. Maisie, Lynn, and Jake, their busboy, stood surrounding him. Is that Minnow? Josie ran outside. Grab that bird, the man shouted. Gumbo was crouched underneath a cafe table. You hurt my bird and I'll murder you, Milo yelled. Jake grabbed her around the waist and hoisted her off her feet as her arms and legs thrashed. Josie held both hands in front of the man. Stop! What's going on? This piece of shit bird took my keys right off the table. It attacked me. Call animal control and shoot it. You're the piece of shit, Minnow said. I told you not to feed him. Minnow, Josie said. Josie dropped to her knees to see Gumbo. Sure enough, a set of keys dangled at the end of the hook of his long bill. If the situation weren't so tense, she'd laugh. Gumbo liked shiny objects. The man was lucky Gumbo hadn't taken off and dropped them into the water. And that waitress, the man pointed to Minnow, with the rude mouth, fire her. That waitress is your best and only chance of retrieving your keys. And if our Pelican swallows them, you can be charged with harming a protected species. It was a white lie. The brown pelican had been removed from the endangered list 6 months earlier. They had had a party to celebrate. Why did the pelican take your keys? Josie asked. The man stepped off the chair, his fist bunched by his side. It lunged for our lunch. I shooed it away, and then it attacked. The man's friend moved between him and Josie. He's lying, Minnow said. Gumbo was on his perch, and he started tossing shrimp at him. I told him to stop. You mean the perch with the sign that says, do not feed the pelican, a new voice said. Brian had walked up onto the deck. He wore sunglasses, but Josie knew he would be sizing up the situation and his blue eyes would be blazing. He had years of experience throwing drunks off the restaurant. Dad, Brian held up a hand to Minnow. Got the strangest call from Maisie and just had to see this. Is someone going to do something, the man said. We are, Brian said. First, you should know, pelicans don't eat shrimp, and especially not. He nodded at the table where he was sitting, shrimp etouffee. Maisie makes one of the best in the state, but he won't eat it. Is this funny to you, the man said. Not in the least. If that pelican swallows those keys, Brian shook his head. Let's everyone back away from the table. Our poor Gumbo is shrinking and shaking in his feathers from the commotion, Maisie said. Please, Josie said. Jake, you can put Minnow down. Minnow stood, her fist by her side. Now share, he said to Minnow. If you would, you know. Brian nodded his head. Not until he apologizes, Minnow said. I won't, Brewster said. Minnow, Josie warned. Fine. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled, 1 long and 2 short notes. Gumbo scuffed his big webbed feet out from beneath the table and wadded over to her. She dropped to her knees and spoke softly. Hey there, handsome. You're scared, but I won't this big man hurt you. The other man picked up his camera and clicked rapid shutter shots, causing Gumbo to swing his head, jangling the keys like a bell. Minnow cooed. She backed away from the crowd and sat with her legs crisscrossed. Gumbo followed. She grabbed the keys and pulled the bird into her lap.
Oh, Sharon, that's a great scene.
Thank you.
Love it. And I can see why that bird is going to be a main character in your book.
Yeah, he was a lot of fun to write.
And I love that you're going to have an audio book because that's the way I read now. If I'm on a train or a car ride or riding my bike, I listen to books and I had to choose my narrators as well. And if you say slight Southern accent, you get some gosh awful accents.
Yeah, and I actually have 2 narrators. I have a female narrator and I have a male narrator. And it was so fascinating, all these different clips, and they were asking me things. And I'm like, I don't know the answer. I don't speak Southern.
Well, I do, but some who try to fake it do not.
Absolutely. That's why if you hear my audiobook, it will sound nothing like that.
But do you have any other books in you?
I do. I have my previous book that I'm hoping a revision will bring her out of the storage shed into the light of day. I'm working on a book right now about an opera singer, actually, who kind of has a crisis of conscience and goes into disguise and to start singing in karaoke bars to get her confidence back. And then I've got another idea that I had started that I had shelved for a little while because it just wasn't ready. And then there's a couple other things ticking away in the background. So I'm pretty productive if I can find the time.
Well, they tell us to write a series to start earning out, or at least 3 books. So it sounds like you're on the right path.
God willing.
You may have to make a series out of this book if everybody loves gumbo so much.
We'll see. There is a character in the book. She's the town's mayor, and I thought if there was going to be a sequel, it would be Louise's story.
Did writing your book and getting it published change your process of writing, or did you become quicker in the process, or what changed after you wrote that manuscript?
Um, I'm a fairly consistent and fast writer. I don't need tricks to get me to sit down and write every day. I have been dabbling, as people will call it, in outlining. I've never been an outliner. I'm a true pantser. I do a lot of research ahead of time and I kind of keep it all in my head. But I find that I kind of waste a lot of time. And so before it's not really an outline, I sit down and write any chapter. I put some prompts on the page. What's the scene goal? What's the conflict? How does this move the story? And lately, for this particular book that I'm writing, I make a note to myself, where can I leave the story early? I'm finding that if I can leave the chapter just a little bit early, it makes it a little bit easier to turn the page. And so that 10 minutes of pre-work and a couple of bullet points has made a huge difference.
Well, I had to put up a whiteboard and put, 1,000 sticky notes up on it to remember that one character had green eyes at the beginning of the book, and by the end of the book, she had brown eyes, and I had to keep up with all of that. But I was writing more slowly because I'm an English major, and I would write a sentence and go back and correct it 10 or 12 times. And finally, I took NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month, where you have to write 50,000 words in the month of November. I took the challenge and I just had to scribble those words out every single day. I think it helped me on my speed writing to do that.
I got my hat to you, because every time NaNoWriMo comes up, I laugh. I'm like, good luck, everybody.
It's pretty crazy.
But it is a fantastic jump shot. I'm at 56,000 words right now. And if I started a book at the end of the month, I had that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It at least gives you something really dirty and messy to edit.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the best money you've ever spent as a writer?
Oh gosh. So the best money accidentally I spent was to go to the Slice Literary Conference in Brooklyn, New York. I had spent a summer in New York City, and I was like, oh, it's a literary conference, let's go. And it was not the literary conference for me. It was very literary. These people were highbrow, writing, nothing wrong with them, writing short stories and poetry. But I was there, and you were allowed to send in like 10 pages of your manuscript and your query letter. And they had agents, and I picked the one agent who I thought would most likely like my story, though they really weren't my agents. And I had heard her on a panel before I met with her, and I'm like, oh God, this woman's going to hate my story. And I met with her, and she was lovely. And she said, oh, your pages are great, which wasn't very helpful. She goes, let's talk about your query letter. And then she proceeded to talk. And then she stopped herself and said, why did you write this book? And this was my previous book. And I told her, and she's like, that needs to be in your query letter. And I kind of had this aha moment about my query letter, which is, for people listening, this is the letter you send off to agents and beg them to take your book. I had this moment about how to do it in a way that was more authentic, was more me, more marketing, and it worked. I had several agent offers because of that query. But the best money I spent on purpose was I took a class. It was during the pandemic, again, looking for something to do to kind of fill in this extra time. I was writing the Pelican Tide, and I came across this class called Writing for Animals. And it is put out by Ashland Creek Press, which is a teeny tiny on-demand publisher in Ashland Creek, Oregon. And they have it's Ashland Creek Press, and they publish under Eco Lit Books. And they, Midge and John, write it. They are publication professionals, and they publish books in the ecology, animal welfare, vegan space. I guess they're both vegans. And they put together this amazing class. They have a couple of offerings. And it's a class, and it's a book, and it's a video series, and then like once or twice in a blue moon they do it live. And it was a whole series. I guess it was about 6 weeks, maybe, or it was, yeah, I think it was about 4 to 6 weeks on the history of animals in literature, how to write for animals to promote them, how to advocate for animals. It was just, I had no idea what to expect. And after going through this class and really considering where I was, is when I rewrote my Pelican. I had never considered, as an editor, animals were always it. Animals, this is how we treat an animal in writing. And I didn't want a talking animal. This isn't, Gumbo isn't, a 630 the dog, or a Maurice the octopus. He is a wild animal. And from this class, I had learned that it was okay to not so much humanize it, but actually use the real life happenings of this animal and incorporate it into an actual character. Originally, he was just a bird that came in and out of the restaurant. And now he's actually part of the family. And that one class, and I talk about this class all the time. People get sick of me talking about it. But that one class and meeting these people, Midge and John they're amazing, and the books that they put out are amazing, and they're so professional, was probably the best money I've ever spent.
Well, that certainly sounds like that seminar was right down your alley.
Yeah. So I tell everybody, just take it.
Well, what does writing success look like to you personally? I think you've already had great success by getting an agent and having your book published by a great publisher, but what does it look like to you personally?
That is one of those ever moving goals. And everybody will tell you that. And I didn't believe that. I thought getting an agent was going to be like, I've made it. And I thought selling my first book was, I've made it. Now I'm like, will I sell the second book? I think for me, eventually it will be having several books on the shelf. But more importantly, hearing from people who I don't know, who will reach out to me and say, I read your book, and have something to say about it and have a conversation. There's plenty of people who will read my book because they know me and will tell me they love it. That's like your mother telling you they love your book. And so I'm looking forward to going to those book clubs, to meeting people who've read and have questions and want to discuss what it is that I'm doing.
That's probably my favorite thing, other than interviewing all of you authors and listening to your own stories. But for readers to be able to pick out something in your book and to really think that it moved them in some way. My first book was about adoption because I'm an adopted child from a maternity home. And so adoption became like a platform. And
Mm-hmm.
you may find that with your Pelican,
Yeah.
and animal rights people, and you'll have all these platforms that you can stand on, and it really, increases the love of that book for so many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Well, this has been a great visit with you today, Sharon.
Thank
And
you.
as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are quite unique. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
Oh gosh, so much advice. I think the first thing I would like to tell people is, don't think that your age has anything to do with your ability to be successful. Um, when I talk to people of my ilk, a lot of us all say that we just didn't have anything that we felt was deep and worthwhile, and enough experiences to bring something new to the page. And sort of being a little bit more seasoned, a little pencil in our hair, allows us to have had experiences, good, bad, and otherwise, and even imagine things that I could not have done in my 20s or even in my 30s. And we also, take everything that you know in life and put it into your writing. And you can only do that when you're over 50 because you have those experiences.
I certainly agree. And I think that's great advice for all of us today. I'm interviewing people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And even last week, a woman who's 101, and they're still turning out beautiful work. So I think writing is like swimming, and we can do it for the rest of our lives. And we're just so excited to have you here today. And we thank you for all you've done with Women's Fiction Writers Association and all the other volunteering that you've done throughout the years to make everything much better for those of us who are authors. So we're excited to now call you one of our authors over 50.
I'm excited to be part of the group.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's D-A-I-L-Y, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.